Long Voyage Back, Part 20. Still standing behind her, Neil didn't reply. The ship's no place for children, Jean went on quietly, especially with reduced rations. No definite destination. People sick. Their whole previous lives gone. Forever. I know, Neil said, but children who've just lost their father, seen their mother beaten up, been hit on the head with a gun butt, aren't likely to be comfortable in any new place, he paused. But Lisa's doing great out here, he went on, and Skippy will too. Give him time. I suppose so, she said, but the portions of food you're making us dole out are so pathetically small. It's frightening. I know, Neil said, then had to grab the back of Jean's settee as a swell sent him staggering. But just ask yourself, how are you going to feed Skippy 2 weeks from today? She grimaced, nodded, and finally managed a small smile. I keep forgetting that the next supermarket may be a decade away. If we're lucky, Neil replied. The radio reports made it clear that on the mainland, supermarkets had ceased to exist even in untouched areas. Everything, even in farming country, was being confiscated and rationed by the military. Food was going to be their major worry for a long, long time. He and Jean had set aside an emergency food supply on their second day at sea, good for 10 days at half rations. But not counting that emergency cachet, they had enough food even at their present low rate of consumption for only 4 or 5 more days. Catching fish was the key to their survival. A random wave slapped loudly at the speeding hull and sent a fine spray up over them in the cockpit. He stood there. He suddenly got a strong sense of Jean's fear and loneliness. I'm afraid stability and the familiar are gone forever, he said quietly. She was still looking out over the sea. Even on land there's no place left to stand, she said in a low voice. In the shattering rush, Neil was aware of her as a woman. Filled with the desire to hold her, protect her, care for her, he released his grip on the wheelhouse roof and took a stride towards her, just as the unexpected swell lifted Vagabond's port hull and then lowered it with a slam, sending Neil tumbling forward and down onto Jean. After clutching her right leg to steady himself, he ended up sitting beside her on the cockpit seat. What's happening? She asked him urgently. Are you all right? Neil laughed softly. He could see her face clearly for the first time in the moonlight. The bruise on her cheek was almost gone, and she looked beautiful. I just wanted to come over and comfort and protect you, he said, smiling. It said I almost knocked you overboard. Gazing wide-eyed at him, she took a while to absorb what he had said. Maybe he'd better get his life preservers, she commented, smiling. For Neil, the world was reduced to her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He pulled her gently toward him, cradling her head against the side of his face, simply holding her close. He noticed the stiffness of her initial response after he felt her suddenly sag against him, relax and sigh. Oh, Neil, she said, and he felt her arms tighten around his back, her powerful hug surprising him. After a long moment they drew apart and Jean tilted her head to look with her large glowing eyes into his. Their faces came together slowly and inevitably and perfectly as Vagabond corrected their course. Their lips touched, wetted, parted and kissed. Neil lost track of time and place, and when the kiss ended and Jean gasped for breath, he instinctively glanced at the sails and sea to assure himself that the ship was still on course. Jean sighed. Well, she said, blinking her eyes and looking a little dazed. Well, how beautiful you are, Neil said. She looked at him uncertainly. Neil! Neil! When Jim's voice invaded their world with the cruel abruptness, Neil released Jean and stood up. Over here, Jim, he said, looking into the wheelhouse and dimly seeing Jim standing by the wheel. Oh, there you are, Jim said, rubbing his eyes. I just came up to go and watch and saw there was no one at the wheel and panicked. Vagabond's sails are balanced, he said. She's self-steering. Really? That's fantastic, Jim said, coming towards Neil. Isn't it about time for me to take the helm? I thought you said... Oh. Hi, Jean. Hi, Jim, Jean said. It's about 12:30, Neil said, glancing at his watch. Since Vagabond was doing the job by herself, I thought I'd let you and Lisa sleep. Thanks, said Jim. Wow, look at that moon. Neil turned to follow Jim's gaze out to the east, his eyes just meeting Jean's briefly. It's quite a night, Neil agreed. I feel great, said Jim. I think I needed the extra sleep. Do you want me to fix you some coffee, Jean asked. Oh, no, I'm fine, said Jim. Besides, Neil says we can't have any coffee at night except under pressure conditions. Pressure conditions? Jean inquired, looking up at Neil. I think it means no coffee unless we're sinking, said Jim, grinning. I doubt we'll be able to get any more coffee unless we end up in South America, Neil commentated, with his usual seriousness. It's now a delicacy. Sorry. "Our Captain Bligh," said Jean, smiling. "He was a marvellous seaman," Neil rejoined. "But unpopular with his crew," said Jean. "I like Neil," said Jim solemnly, and Jean and Neil both laughed. A sudden violent snapping and flapping from the bow sent Neil rushing past Jim over to starboard. The Genoa was luffing, and the Vagabond was veering off course upwind. He turned the wheel to port. When he saw her swing back on course, he realised that the Genoa sheet had come loose. "Winch the Jenny in," he said to Jim, who followed him over to help. As he steadied Vagabond's course, he watched Jim pull in the line, controlling Genoa, first by hand, and then with 3 turns around the winch. "Far enough?" Jim asked. "A little more," Neil said. When the Genoa was sheeted to Neil's satisfaction and the Vagabond once again contentedly galloped southward through the night, Neil turned the helm over to Jim. "I think she'll steer herself still," Neil said, "but you may have to adjust the Jenny or mizzen sheets to get it right. Do you remember how I showed you?" "Sure, I got her now." "Good." Neil turned to see if Jean was still there, and saw her standing next to the entrance to her cabin. He walked over to stand behind her, just touching her, their backs to Jim, looking out to sea. "How strange it is," she said softly after a long pause. "Here my husband is dead, millions killed, millions more doomed, and all I can think of is wanting a man I've known for just a few days in bed with me." Startled, he turned to her. "Jean?" he said. "But I can't." "Jean?" he whispered again. "Life doesn't offer us much these days. We should take what we can." They were only a few inches apart. She turned to look up at him. The moonlight fell on her face, his in shadow. "No, Neil," she said softly. "There are others, and, my God, only 4 days. I think I owe it to Bob and to Frank, to you even, to assume it's just temporary insanity." "We should always be insane like this," Neil said. "No, Neil," she said, and squeezed his hand once, disappearing down her cabin steps. Vaguely Neil thought she might also have whispered a good night. He reluctantly slid her hatch closed, and feeling exhilarated and alive, headed back to the wheelhouse. Jim was sitting on the edge of the other cockpit combing, staring forward. "I'm going to rest here in the wheelhouse," Neil said to him. "And if you fall overboard," he went on, noting Jim's somewhat precarious perch on the boat, "remember to leave a forwarding address." "An island in the South Pacific," Jim responded immediately. Stretching out on the cushions, Neil yawned. "You'd better be in good shape," he commented. "Good night," he heard Jim say to him. "That's my impression," said Neil, smiling to himself until the sudden image of Frank chilled him. Vagabond, indifferent to it all, plunged onwards through the night. After Neil had fallen asleep on the cushions in the back of the wheelhouse, Jim was forced to take the helm. The wind had picked up and was heading them more. He wasn't able to get the sails adjusted so that Vagabond could steer herself any more. Even though he looked forward to her company on their watch, he decided to let Lisa sleep a little longer. He wanted time alone to think. Although Jim had disagreed with his father at the time, Jim admired him for trying to get back home to Oyster Bay to try to save their mother and Susie. Jim knew that Frank had a fierce loyalty to his family, a sense of family pride that often made him act too severely towards his children. Now that he himself was all the family that his father had left, Jim felt a sense of responsibility towards him he'd never felt before. This sense of caring was increased by his realization that, more than any of the others on board, his father still appeared to be in a state of shock. Jim knew that he'd been hurt by Neil's taking command of Vagabond, and that of course his radiation sickness must be depressing him. Jim could see that Frank lacked his usual dynamic energy. When Jim had been helping him tear down the remains of the shattered rear wall of the wheelhouse and replace it with a sailcloth awning that could be raised and lowered, Frank had been enthusiastic about the task for about half an hour, and then had lost interest, wandering away and leaving the project for someone else to finish. The only person who seemed to be able to bring him back to life was Jean. When she had suggested that all the men should take turns working in the kitchen, he had smiled at her and argued playfully, "What's the sense of surviving if I had to wash my own dishes?" But nevertheless had cleaned up the galley more cheerfully than Jim had ever seen. When Jean had become impatient with Skippy's clinging, Frank had spent close to an hour playing horsey and card games with him. Since he knew that his father cared about Jean's feelings, the way that Neil and Jean had been whispering together in the side cockpit earlier made Jim uneasy. For though he'd been too caught up in the rush for survival over the last 4 days to feel grief for his mother and Susie, now when he was aware of his father's problem, he felt a sense of loss. He would never be able to express his love and appreciation for his mother. She had been cheated out of the love that both he and Frank would have given her had she survived to be with them now. Jim's feelings for his father were reinforced by the sense of having failed his mother. But how could he help him? Lisa stepped from her mother's cabin out into the moonlight and then into the wheelhouse. "It's our watch," she said. "Why didn't you wake me?" She was wearing jeans and a blue windbreaker, her hair dark and long like her mother's, tied in a ponytail. Since none of them could wash with fresh water, everyone's hair was getting stiff and straggly. "Until the winds got too strong, Vagabond was self-steering," Jim replied in a low voice, motioning towards Neil. "Careful, Neil's sleeping." "Oh," she responded, glancing to her right. Jim felt a little burst of happiness at her nearness as she came to stand beside him at the helm. He took her hand in his. Even though they had flirted with each other the previous summer, and were even closer now since the horrors of the war, Jim had felt almost asexual, as if anything too pleasant must be obscene. But they needed to touch each other, and they often held hands while on watch. "Mom's pacing woke me up," Lisa said softly. "She's going up and down like a subway shuttle." "I'm glad you're here," Jim said, thinking of Jean and Neil embracing but not wanting to tell Lisa. For a moment they stood silently, Vagabond plunging and hissing through the night. "Vagabond's really moving, isn't he?" said Lisa. "It's great," Jim whispered back. "You want something to drink?" Lisa asked. "No, I'm okay." "Did you check on Seth?" "Oh, no, I didn't." Lisa took a flashlight and went aft to Neil's cabin to see if Seth needed anything. Seth's right thigh had become infected, and whether the antibiotic Macklin was administering would clear up the infection still hadn't been determined. Steph had tried to make a joke of the whole thing by saying, "That's the last time I come up on deck to find out what's going on." As Lisa pushed back the hatch and stared down the short ladder, she was startled to see a dim light and the figure of Conrad Macklin sitting in the darkness beside Seth, who seemed to be sleeping. "Oh," Lisa said, frightened. "Can I help you?" Macklin asked quietly. I didn't know. I was checking on Seth." "He's alive," Macklin stated indifferently. What are you... "You ever tried sleeping up forward?" Macklin answered. "I was bouncing like someone was dribbling me." "Oh," said Lisa, noticing a red glow, indicating Neil's radio was on, and that Macklin had some papers in his lap. "I'm sleeping back here," Macklin went on, "until your boyfriend stops trying to smash my skull against the forward cabin roof." Lisa left. The surge and sway below decks had left her feeling slightly nauseous, and her encounter with Macklin made her uneasy. On her way back to the wheelhouse, she noticed a light on in Frank's cabin, and she mentioned to Jim that Macklin was with Seth and that his father seemed to be up. "Dad's not sleeping well," Jim said. "He's still sick." "I know," said Lisa, taking Jim's hand in hers. "Do you think it's... I hope it'll go away in a few days," said Jim. "Neil and Ollie don't seem too bad, and they were exposed about as much." "Mom thinks he's a little depressed about losing... your mother." Jim merely nodded, staring forward into the darkness. "Do you think she's dead?" Lisa asked softly. "Yes," said Jim. "My dad's dead too," said Lisa. "Sometimes it seems like he never lived. Everything is so changed." Lisa released his hand and steadied herself against the control panel shelf. "It's strange," Jim said, putting his arm around her waist. "Everything I used to be interested in, sports, music, cars, seems sort of far away. I tried to listen to some of my favourite tapes and I started to, I felt like crying. It was pretty funny." Lisa didn't reply but gently moved closer. She wanted to put her arm around him but felt awkward and left her hands on the moulding. "I'm glad you're here, Lisa," Jim went on softly. "I get kind of lonely with my dad. Sick and Neil all wrapped up in the boat. You're about the only part of the old world that seems all right." I'm glad you're here too," she said, letting her head rest against his shoulder. "We'll be all right, won't we, Jim?" There was a wistful quality in her voice that Jim felt viscerally. He hesitated, all the horrors past and still possible clamouring for his attention. "Yes," he replied simply, pulling her more tightly against him and ignoring the clamour. "But not unless we take the Genoa down and reef up the main." She looked at him puzzled. "The wind's gotten too strong," he went on. "I think the number 1 watch team better reduce sail." She smiled and took over the wheel from Jim, who smiled back and went off to get his safety harness and go forward.